Hello everyone, welcome. We're continuing this excellent book, The Sword of Allah. Let's pick it up where we left off. We were on page 106. The Holy Prophet surveyed the scene before him, and the scene was anything but promising. He decided not to let Malik get away with such an easy victory. He turned to Abbas and ordered him to call the Muslims to rally around him. Abbas was a large man with a powerful voice which, according to some accounts, could be heard miles away. Now he yelled at the top of his voice, "O Muslims, come to the Messenger of Allah! O Ansar! O companions! O—" He called each tribe in turn to report to the Prophet. So basically, he's letting them all know. The Ansar, that's right. The call was heard by most of the Muslims, and they at once began to move to where the Prophet stood. As soon as first 100 men had gathered beside the Prophet, he ordered a counterattack. These men assailed those of the Hawazin who were nearest to the Prophet and drove them back. Okay, so that's interesting. Soon the assembling Muslims increased in number until thousands of them had rejoined the Prophet. When the Prophet felt that sufficient strength had been gathered around him, he ordered a general attack against the Hawazin. Okay, so let's write that on the top. Hawazin. This time it was Malik who was surprised. Having been certain that victory was his, he now found that his own army was under attack. Right? Wasn't that like in Ramsay Bolton in Game of Thrones, remember? When the Lords of the Vale, House Aaron, Littlefinger and Sansa show up and Ramsay's like, "Oh, I just thought they was doing the pincer move on the wildlings and Jon Snow." And he's like, "Oh, the cavalry came in." The hand-to-hand fighting became more desperate. Could you imagine? I'm telling you though, sometimes just thinking about that gives me goosebumps. The amount of testosterone just radiating from all that just group of like life or death. Could you imagine? And this is just what the Muslims wanted, for in this sort of violent fighting their superiority in swordsmanship put the odds in their favor. In close quarter battle the Muslims had no equal. Gradually the Hawazin were pressed back, and the Prophet saw their men fall before the onslaught of the Muslims. He affirmed, "In truth I am the Prophet, I, the son of Abdul Muttalib." Son of Abdul Muttalib. He then turned to those who stood next to him and remarked, "Now the oven heats up." Oh snap! I think today we say like shots fired, like, oh, it's turning up that heat. Malik decided that he was getting the worst of the fighting and put his withdrawal plan in action. The Saqif were already in position a short distance behind the Hawazin. Okay, so they're behind the Hawazin. Leaving the Saqif to act as a rear guard. Okay, so this is the key for the rear guard. He pulled the Hawazin back to safety. The Muslims moved forward and made contact with the Saqif, who now began to receive heavy punishment from the believers. Soon after this contact, Saqif turned and took to their heels, followed by other tribal contingents, some of which had taken no part in the fighting. In the meantime, Malik had got to Hawazin safely to the pass, and here he deployed them to fight a defensive battle while waiting for stragglers to catch up. Oh, that's interesting, right? So he's like, "Hey, we're going to stand here, keep fighting up. We got to wait for the others to come up." They didn't just abandon them. Sometimes you can totally forget that. I didn't even think about that. That like you have to kind of wait for your other soldiers. Like something in my head says like, "Oh, they might just abandon them and leave them," but then you would really like disenfranchise and dishearten your soldiers if you were to move on without them. And also, you kind of do have to gather up your soldiers, right? Because if not, they can get captured and get tortured and reveal all your strategies. As long as he held this pass, the families and the flocks of the Hawazin were safe. The Muslims had not only recovered from the shock of the ambush, but had counterattacked, regained their position, and driven the enemy from the battlefield. This was a tactical victory, but more was to come. While the Muslims were stripping the Saqif dead of their weapons and clothing, an interesting incident involved two Muslims took place. One was an Ansar from Medina, and the other man by the name of Mughira bin Shuba. Mughira means the raider, the fighter, right? Mughira. If I have a dog, I'm gonna name him Mughira. That's just every time I see this word, Bagheera. No, was it Bagheera or Mughira? Either way, the ira, the way it sounds, like not the vowels and stuff, but like and then Gihira, like it just sounds so cool. Who belonged to the tribe of Sakif. Okay, so Mughira bin Shuba, he's from the Sakif, and then there's another dude who's an Ansar. Among the Sakif dead was a Christian slave who had died beside his master. Now this is interesting, right? So slavery exists all over the world. For some reason, our media just seems to only focus on the slavery of America in the 1700s. But indeed, here we see that Christians were slaves and people were slaves all over the world. And this guy died next to his own master. As the Ansar stripped the slave, he noticed that the dead man was not circumcised. Ugh, gross! Oh, that would be horrible if you see that. Oh! I mean, okay, wait a minute though. See, to me, as a woman, I wouldn't strip somebody down to that level, is what I mean. Like, I don't want to see that. You just check, like in the video game, you just check the pockets, you go on your way, right? But here it's like, apparently they took everything, right? I mean, some Native American tribes scalped. Others, I mean, so many different cultures all across the world, how they cleaned up their battlefield said a lot about them. Some took off ears, noses. Others literally just wanted the crows and the scavengers to eat them. How the opposing army treats the dead says a lot about them. I mean, even in the fantasy genres, when Ramsay goes around with his knife and he starts stabbing all the soldiers that remain on the field, but then when Robb Stark in the beginning, season 1, I think it is, season 1 or season 2, where they have like religious nurses who can treat both sides, and they let the wounded get taken off the battlefield. So there, like I said, there's a lot of different examples of how the dead are treated, but this guy got stripped so naked that his pee-pee showed. Amazed at this discovery, for circumcision was a universal practice among the Arabs. I did not know that. I thought that was just a Jewish thing, and then it slowly went out. But then again, there were Jewish Arabs, right? He called aloud to those who stood around him. "Oh, Arabs, did you know that Sakif are not circumcised?" Mughira, who stood next to the Ansar, was horrified to hear this, as the spread of such a report would mean disgrace for the Sakif. Why, though? Oh, because if you do it, it's like you made that sort of pain sacrifice to show you're part of the covenant with God, because God said you had to do that to your pee-pee. He knew the dead slave and could understand how the misunderstanding had arisen. "Don't say that," he hissed at the Ansar. "This man was a Christian slave." "No, he was not," insisted the Ansar. "I am sure that he is one of the Sakif." And he remained unconvinced until Mughira had undressed several bodies of the Sakif and pointed out familiar signs. Oh, ew, gross. Like, I get it. They're seeing dead bodies, right? They're soldiers. They've probably seen men urinate on themselves and defecate on themselves when they're dead, right? Because they say when you die, you poop yourself. And then in 2 hours, your body goes stiff. And then you start stinking, right? So I'm sure these soldiers back then, obviously, like, saw much more brutality than maybe today, but for some reason, man, it's just a little bit like, hey man, we'll check the pockets for gold or like for a silver bracelet, but once you get to the undies level, that's where you gotta cut it off for me, you know what I mean? Like, even if the army was all women, I'd be like, I'm not checking your bra, I'm not checking your undies, pocket on this side, pocket on that side, gotta go. You know what I mean?